Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for our session on recruiting and retaining teachers of color, how and why it matters. My name is David Donaldson with the National Center for Grow Your Own. We are honored to be co-hosting this event with our friends at Educators Rising, and we have incredible experts who I just deeply admire for the work that they do that will bring a different perspectives and experiences to this conversation today. And so with that, Sharif, Amanda, and James, if you wouldn't mind turning on your cameras and coming off mute. And we'll start with Sharif El-Mekki. Sharif, would you mind introducing yourself and a little bit about the work that you do and what brings you to the conversation today?
Thank you, David. It's great to be here with James and Amanda as well, and as well as the community. Sharif El-Mekki, I was a teacher and a principal for 26 years, all in Philadelphia. And the last 5 years, we've been working at the Center for Black Educator Development, working to rebuild a national Black teacher pipeline, starting with high school students and supporting them all the way through their early career in teaching. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Sharif. Amanda?
Hi, good afternoon to everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and just colleagues in the work. It's always nice to be surrounded by colleagues in this work that we're going to be talking about today. So I'm the CEO and founder of Latinos for Education, and ours is a national organization that's focused on the development and leadership development of more Latinos in the education sector. So right now, we don't have enough Latinos in the teaching profession, and nor do we have enough that are accelerating into leadership roles and decision-making roles relative to the growing population of Latino students. So we focus our work on providing various fellowships that support retention of educators as well as accelerating leadership. In addition to that, we do advocacy and policy work that is designed to remove obstacles to more Latino children receiving the education that they deserve. But right now, we're really focusing our policy and advocacy work on educator diversity. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all today.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. And I know we're going to talk more about that policy and advocacy work you do a little later. I'm excited to hear more about that. James?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm James Lane. I'm the CEO of PDK International, and our largest program by far is Educators Rising, which is a career and technical education program that we put in high schools across America to convince high school students to become teachers and, frankly, to become teachers in their home community. It's built on kind of the grow your own model, which we've seen lead to an incredible diversity of teachers in those communities with 52% of students nationally being students of color, 53% of students in Educators Rising are students of color. And so we are definitely focused not only on growing the teaching workforce, but also diversifying it. Before coming to PDK, I was in the Biden administration and I led the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. Before that, I was the state superintendent, Virginia district superintendent principal, but ultimately was also a band director. And so I was a band director that got to do some of these fun other things. And so, but excited to be with you today and excited to be with Sharif and Amanda especially.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it. One thing about, for everybody that's watching this right now or will be watching the recording, Amanda, Sharif, and James, you're going to be very blessed to hear what they have to say today. But I just want to say they're also all really cool people outside of their work as well. So I'm just excited for the conversation today. So Sharif, let's go ahead and get started with you. We talk about a lot the research, plenty of research out there that says all students benefit when they have at least one teacher of color in their K-12 education experience. But I'm kind of curious about what are the benefits of having a diverse staff on the staff itself? How can that affect the morale? How can that affect the retention of teachers?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks for that question. There's the feedback from teachers of color, in particular, talk about, trying not to be the lone and lonely, the staff member of color in the building. And what they find is that being able to advocate, being able to support, being able to have, colleagues who understand them, who see them, who can listen to them and work together, not just to, have someone in proximity, but also to ensure that they can work together to address, policies, procedures, rules, regulations that do not support student achievement and staff support. But it's also interesting that we've also heard pretty consistently across the country, both as my role as a principal, as well as a U.S. Department of Ed fellow, when I got to visit schools throughout, white teachers talk about how their practice has strengthened when they are in a diverse community. They feel that, they have access to curricular choices that they had never heard of, that it was not part of their schooling. It was not part of their undergrad or graduate schooling, right? So they're learning about authors and articles and perspectives. They said they're learning about how to engage with communities of color, how to communicate, and how to hold high expectations and high levels of support. So they're finding, and some of them have mentioned, like, this is the best professional development I've actually had, was being in proximity of diverse educators. And they feel that when they're not, they have this myopic view of how they were raised and taught, and it limits their effectiveness with an increasingly diverse student body.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that, Sharif. Amanda, James, anything you care to add?
I think everything Sharif said is something you hear in the Latino community as well. I think one of the differences I'll say just a little bit about is, we talk about the brown tax in the educator workforce, but on a language perspective as well. So what we find often is that the Latino educators are often the only Spanish-speaking individual in the building and are often asked to play various roles outside of their teaching role. So that is where that tax comes from, is where I have this extra workload, but I don't get compensated for it. So relative to the question though, look, it's important that we have these various perspectives and voices. That language piece is super important because of the cultural competency that's brought in. That's also something that can be learned by other educators. And so that ability, to Sharif's point, to bridge across cultures, is really important and can really make for a better environment.
And the only thing I was going to add is when we look at the research on retention, and Sharif talked about this, but pay is a factor, the support of the principal is a factor, and then of course the amount of extra work that you make a teacher do, the working conditions are a factor. And there's no doubt that when you have a staff that is not diverse and there's only one or two people being called upon constantly to be the voice of an entire community, which is, difficult in its own right, potentially inappropriate in its own right, but then asking them to take on extra duties, it is too much to ask. And these are usually new teachers, right? These are not the long-standing veterans in most communities. It's more often than not someone that's just trying to figure out how to get their own classroom right, and then you're asking them to be an expert on matters that other staff in the building are not expert on, and you ought to give our teachers the time to develop their own practice, and that will support retention. But back to your bigger point, if we had a much more diverse workforce at the onset, and there was a group of mentors for the younger teachers and the experienced teachers, and could show them the ropes of how to work with different backgrounds of students, we would certainly improve retention rates. Because what I find is that when teachers feel like they're supported, not just by the administration, but their colleagues, and they have a community, a best friend at work, I think is what Gallup calls the Q12 question, where they can tap into those folks and say, look, I'm struggling today, I need your help. That's going to make a difference. But if you're the only person that has any background in or like yourself, you're always going to feel isolated, and you're never going to feel as a part of the community as you could if the leadership made it a priority to diversify everyone around you.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you all. I also want to acknowledge people feel free to put questions in the chat. We have set aside time at the end to go over as many questions as we can. Um, just some of what you all are saying is just making me think. I used to run talent at a district level and at a state level. And at the state level, uh, we had 40 districts without even one teacher of color. And I always wrestled with what, like, how do you approach that work? Like, are is it fair to be asking somebody to break that barrier, to break that, have the Jackie Robinson effect on that district? I've always like, it was an interesting thing, like to wrestle with, and just something that I don't have the answers on that one. But maybe something, Amanda, Sharif, or James, if you want to speak to, um, or Sharif, I just saw you come off mute. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a really important question to wrestle with. I think the first question though is what kind of ecosystem are we inviting people into? And so, that 40% in Pennsylvania, it's over 50%, right? With no diverse educators at all. And so before we even ask someone to do the Jackie Robinson, entry plan, really assessing, okay, what are we inviting people into? How is this ecosystem? How is this supportive? What's the level of anti-racism that they're committed to? What's the level of equity that they're committed to? On the flip side, just like Amanda talked about this tax, Dr. John King used to say invisible tax, right? When you're siloed and by yourself, then that can be exacerbated. What we've found is folks who are in cohorts are better. So it'd be much better, I think, to have this long-term strategic plan. And instead of saying, oh, you get a Latino teacher, you get a Black teacher, you get a, Asian teacher, and one by one, really cohorting. And as you're cohorting, also supporting the other schools and districts to improve their practice so that it is a welcoming and sustaining and respectful environment. Right. We talk about retention, but retention, if you break it down, is really about, is this person, do they feel respected and professionally fulfilled? So making sure the ecosystem can support that. But cohorting, I think, is probably the best model short term.
Yeah. Appreciate that, Sharif. Amanda, we're going to start with you on this one, and then Sharif and James, feel free to jump in. Amanda, I like to say that the best recruitment strategy is having a better retention strategy, and Sharif kind of just spoke to that. What are schools and/or districts that are successful in retaining their teachers of color doing that is working?
So that is a great question and is not an easy one to answer in terms of a lot of bright spots that are out there. And it shows because we've been pretty flat with representation of Latino educators for many years across the country. We're still at about 8% representation of Latino teachers across the country. So it shows that we're not really seeing this increase in both recruitment and retaining educators of color. And that says something, but we are in 3 different regions across the country, and we are working with many districts through district partnerships to bring in more of their educators into our fellowship. So I will speak to that. And so, first, and Sharif said it, but it's the stated goal by the district on in their strategic plans. Shows some promise when at the district level you're seeing these stated goals around diversifying their workforce, and that's really important. Along with that comes the dedicated resources and funding that will support things like the professional development that's needed. And relative to the cohorting, that's what we do at Latinos for Education. And in most school districts where a Latino child will never have a Latino educator, what we've done is created through our fellowships opportunities for those cohorts of Latino educators who might be working in various districts across a city, that we create that cohort for them to experience the teaching profession, the support, and the acceleration of their leadership together. And so if you don't have it within your district or within your school, we provide these types of fellowships, which you're seeing more and more of happening across the country, to ensure that those spaces are available to educators of color. So that is the reason why Latinos for Education exists, is because we weren't seeing enough of the professional development support in district that would support both the retention and acceleration of leadership. So I think, again, it's the stated goals and strategic plans, is having dedicated resources and funding to actually work on these issues at the district level. And then it's investing in professional development through programs and opportunities like ours that happen through nonprofits, but you're also seeing some of that happen at the state level as well, where more of these programs are being offered to help diversify the workforce and support the retention of educators of color.
Yeah, I love what what Amanda shared, and I think we were dismayed, and I'll put it in the chat, this toolkit, but we were dismayed of how many people were reaching out to us and saying, oh, we're looking for a Black teacher. We got a vacancy. We want to diversify. And, we were really just challenging them. It's like, okay, well, what's your retention plan for the people? Number one. Number two, we don't have Black teachers in our back pocket. We have a model for you to develop and support in retention as well as the recruitment. And so, we ended up, working with our colleagues to develop a toolkit for school and district staff, and really school leaders and school leadership team, not just the principal, and then principal supervisors to be able to support, because we kept hearing over and over and over, from principals that, yeah, my supervisor doesn't really know how to support me in retaining. They're more apt to tell me about the bulletin boards that need, to be updated in my building, as opposed to, okay, how can I support a diverse educator workforce in my school? And so this was to support that group, but also school leadership teams, because it can't just be a principal. It has to be, it's a all hands on deck effort to address the ecosystem and the inequity they're in.
What I was going to add here in retention, I mentioned before, there are three major factors that come up. One is compensation, one is the support of the administration, and then the other is the working conditions for the teacher. And compensation, I use that phrase rather than salary, because there's a lot that we can do in this space that's not just raising salaries. One of the things that we find is that a lot of teachers of color want to work in areas where they can live close to the school, and there's usually not housing that is near to the school community that they want to teach in, unless they're teaching in a suburban or urban environment, which keeps a lot of teachers of color out of rural communities. And so, I've seen things where districts have built housing for firefighters, police officers, and teachers, so that they can live in the community and have an opportunity to build a life like everyone else that's living in the community. And that's for any teacher, not just focused necessarily on just diversifying the pipeline of teachers. Another strategy that we've seen is, obviously, there's a huge focus on loan forgiveness. And, one strategy around retention is for, so many years of service, loans will be forgiven. Well, that already exists, right? The federal government already has that available, and that if you essentially work for 10 years as a teacher, you can have all of your loans forgiven. And if you haven't seen the Public Service Loan Forgiveness website, highly recommend anyone that works in education go there. You may be paying for loans you may not know that you can have forgiven immediately, I would imagine. And then the third big thing in the compensation bucket is just base pay. I don't know a single teacher, and I mean I have hundreds that just live in my neighborhood. I don't know a single teacher that doesn't have a side job of some kind. It may be coaching, it may be tutoring, but for some it's driving Uber or Instacart, or working at a retail shop on Saturdays and Sundays. And if we've gotten to the point that such an important full-time job requires you to have a second job to be able to pay your mortgage, have a family, all the things that anyone wants in America, then we're very far from retaining the number of teachers we need to retain. And then you add on top of that the issues of isolation, the issues of principal treatment, and whether teachers are treated like professionals and given other duties and having to cover classes for other teachers when they're out, and all these other things that we're adding from a pressure standpoint. And then you add on top of that all of the extra paperwork and working conditions that go along with that. That's what's really straining the retention pipeline. And so there's not going to be a silver bullet. It's making, like Sharif said, it's making sure that principals are trained on how to support teachers, keep them out of extra duties so they can focus on their students, grading papers, the things that they really care about. Let's make sure we're compensating them to the point that they're not doing a million other jobs. And let's find a way for teachers to live in the community and be a part of the community that kids came from. And if we can do just those simple things, which is actually a lot, yeah, sure, we would have no retention issues. So we've got a lot of work to do to build back the pipeline to where it was. When I started hiring as a principal, I would get 50 applicants for an elementary teaching job. And by the time I left the superintendency to become superintendent in 2018, we would be lucky to get 1 or 2 people for an elementary teaching job. And so you'll hear people say in the lexicon that there is not a sheer shortage, all the positions are getting filled every year. That may be true in some communities, but it's not getting filled with the quality that we have seen in the past and with the numbers and options for principals that we've seen in the past. And that's largely because of these factors that we've put in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get really upset when people say there's not a teacher shortage, and it's all these researchers, right? And yes, research matters, but we need to talk about exactly what you said, James, the quality of the applicants. There's people trying to say now that it's reverse, that enrollment is going back up in schools of education after the last 10 years. And yeah, the only reason it's going up is because of all those, well, I can say it, I don't work in government anymore, but all the crappy programs that enroll today or teacher tomorrow, like that, all these alternative programs that are not quality, they're not true residencies and things like that. Amanda, I want to highlight, I think it was the second bullet you said, like, good practices are states and districts putting their money where their mouth is. Show me your budget, and that shows me your value. So thank you for that. James, I'm coming to you on this next question first, and then Sharif and Amanda jump in, but you kind of hit on this a little bit. We take the stance at National Center for Grow Your Own, and Sharif, you put this in the chat, you shouldn't even have loans to begin with. We believe in America, you should be able to become a teacher for free and get paid to do so. And programs like Educators Rising are helping remove financial barriers by helping students, get first off excited and aware about the opportunity to teach, but also, the right type of programming and college credit. So, James, speaking of recruitment, how can schools and districts leverage Grow Your Own and registered apprenticeship programs to attract teachers of color? Or future teachers of color.
Yeah, thank you. So an interesting stat that our company was largely founded on is that 60% of teachers end up teaching within 20 miles of where they went to high school themselves. And so, and then I don't know where the other 40% go, but if I had to guess, the other 40% of teachers end up teaching within 20 miles where they went to college. If I had to guess, that there's probably a large piece of that, but we know that 60% teach within 20 miles of where they went to high school. And so the reason that Educators Rising's program has been successful at bringing a lot of diverse candidates into the teaching pool is because of that focus that we have on growing within the community. So at Educators Rising, we put a career and technical education program in the high schools to convince kids to become teachers. We teach them based on the best techniques that we know are available. Our curriculum is aligned to the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards and other standards. And we pair that with a club and after-school experience where students can then go to conferences and competitions to eventually become national champions in Ed Rising. Very much like any career and technical education program, Skills USA, DECA, FBLA, so on and so forth. But what makes our program unique is that we don't just support the students in high school. We ensure that they get dual enrollment credit. We have preferred university partners that are much more accepting of educators and supporting them in the first couple of years of college. But the big piece is two other components. We encourage our preferred universities to allow students to teach back in their home community. And we encourage the districts to guarantee contracts to anyone that completed Educators Rising and the college certification. Now, what's been added to this mix is a lot of interest right now, and I know the National Center for Grow Your Own does this, is a lot of interest in kids going right from high school into the workforce as a paraprofessional while earning their certification to become a teacher. And Educators Rising supports all of those pathways. And that's the more traditional registered apprenticeship pathway where folks get into the workforce, they get paid to work while they earn their degree. So they don't take on student debt, like David was saying, and we make sure that they can get an experience in the classroom. And frankly, the teachers that I hired that were parapros that did it for a few years actually came into the classroom better prepared than student teachers that had only done it for a semester. And so our work, we are really agnostic about the million different ways that people can go to get certified. We focus our work on getting them into the pre-apprenticeship or pre-student teaching experience so that they even want to become a teacher on the front end. And we give them high school experiences where they can learn to love being around kids and develop that foster of learning and learn more about themselves through learning about other people. And we build in experiences for them to learn about different techniques such as culturally relevant teaching or opportunities for students to learn about students of other backgrounds or how to prepare lessons for students with disabilities. And there's so many different ways that a teacher can choose from the menu of lessons that we provide. But ultimately, what we know is that if we don't start building a pipeline, forget about high school and middle school, where kids are thinking and seeing teaching as a potential for their future, then we're really missing the boat, because the idea that kids are going to get into college, maybe they double major in education, and hopefully one day they'll choose or they'll leave their big career and come into education. We're not seeing that in massive numbers. We've got to make sure people see education as a career. And it's the reason we're Educators Rising and not Teachers Rising is I can't think of a job that you couldn't do in your school system. You want to be a doctor? We have doctors. You want to be a nurse? We have nurses. You want to be a police officer? We have police officers. You want to be a social worker? We have social workers. And you want to drive a truck for a living? We have truck drivers and bus drivers, right? And so what we want people to see is that working for your local school system and working for your community is an option for you no matter what you want to do. Engineering, civil engineering, whatever, all of those are available to you. And we build that. And I'll put a link to our work in the chat.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it. Amanda, I said I would come to you about this based on your introduction earlier, but can you share more about Latinos for Education's advocacy efforts and how your organization has taken a policy and legislative approach to this work?
Yes, so thanks for the question. It's a both and for us. We have to do the practice change work and we have to be involved with policy change, which we're doing at the state and federal level. I'm really excited about the work we're doing here in Massachusetts, where I live. We introduced the Educator Diversity Act in the last session. We had two co-sponsors in the legislature who took on our bill. The bill was developed by a coalition of over 50 organizations, nonprofits, higher education, teachers unions, charter networks, you name it. And so it's been a really important piece of work for us to advance what we see as model legislation that's been developed and co-developed by all of these actors who are so important to the education ecosystem and who have committed to saying we've got to diversify the educator workforce. And we've coupled that with work that's being done at the state level. The Department of Education here in Massachusetts, of which I was a board member of, and I was a co-chair of Diversifying the Educator Workforce Committee, made a commitment to say we need to diversify the educator workforce, and we're going to commit to doing that. By the year 2030, we want to increase to having 26% representation of people of color. So we had the engine, right? We had sort of the fuel, the energy toward diversification. We were able to get important sponsors of our bill. And while our bill did not pass in the first session, we're in the second session now of having the bill being supported. And we believe that we're in a really good position to get that bill done. And we have a roadmap for it. So if people care to learn more about some of the first steps we took to sort of get this legislation off the ground, I'm happy to share that. And what I will say is, again, this model legislation we think is something that's so comprehensive because it speaks to eliminating financial barriers for educators. It speaks to the teacher certification process and making sure that there are multiple ways to certify educators, given that many educators of color have challenges with certification, at least in the state of Massachusetts and others. So we have these provisions in this bill that speak to a lot of these barriers that we just talked about. So we think it will be so important if this bill can get done that we are holding our districts accountable. Our Department of Education is held accountable, and we're directing resources and support to districts to actually build these pipelines and remove those barriers that so often keep our prospective educators of color out, and as we've been talking about, retaining them. So I will share a link to all of this information. And I'll also just say we are part of the 1 Million Teachers of Color Coalition, along with Sharif and so many other organizations that are dedicated to having a groundswell of work happening across the country that really focuses on removing these barriers through policy change. So this is a key lever that I don't think we can be successful in diversification of our educator workforce and retention if we don't engage in policy change.
Thank you, Amanda. And Sharif just put in the chat about the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign that you just referenced as well. So for folks interested, and Amanda, Sharif, James, please feel free to keep putting things and resources in the chat as they come up. I also want to acknowledge we're getting a lot of good questions as well. So I might call a audible and maybe ask 1 or 2 more questions of us and then dive into the audience ones because I want to make sure those folks we'll do as many of those as we can. Sharif, and this kind of hits on one of the questions in the chat. Every year you host a massive conference, sold out before people can even get tickets. I feel like it's just a guaranteed sellout. Focus on Black male educators. What has been the takeaways that you've seen and learned from by hosting it every year? And I'm also kind of curious, are there been changes in the takeaways from when you started it versus, last year's big event?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, our first convening, it's hard to believe that it's been 10 years now. It was back in 2014, and it was very small, regional. But it was the idea of this African tradition of lifting as you climb, particularly, Mary Church Terrell talked about that for Black educators. Like that was the work that people were doing. And it's evolved where, where now people are not only lifting as they climb, but they're also, it's been great to see people going back to their communities and figuring out, okay, how do I support the Black men who are there? So it's about agency, but it's also, last year's theme was collective work, responsibility, and accountability, right? Like, how do you build this community of Black men educators? How do we dispel notions that Black men aren't interested in teaching? Where we see the exact opposite, as far as Black men with college degrees, the largest percentage of them are actually educators, right? And so there's constantly been this, this support, this, this organizing, these efforts that we find in Black men educators. And interesting enough, we found the themes that we've, take away from them in the feedback sessions very consistent with, research, as well as like, papers that, for example, we did a report with Dornish Chews and Ed Rising, very specifically looking at Black men, what were their experiences, how are they, being able to show up or not, You know, how are they being told to erase? What's the invisible tax impact? Who invited them into the profession? All of those, things playing a part. And, I'll put that in the chat, but, with this idea of Black men's voices, even though it's, like the last data point I saw was like 1.3% of public school teachers are Black men, which is like crazy to me, you know. But there are ways to invite them into the profession, because we also see, and this is the feedback we also got, like they are adjacent to schools often, adjacent to classrooms often. So what are the barriers that are keeping them from, leading that classroom in a very, supported way? So we've continued to evolve, and we're looking forward to this year. November 21st through the 23rd, always the Thursday and Saturday before Thanksgiving here in Philadelphia. So looking forward to that. And again, it's open to all, but about 85% identify as Black men. But it's open to all, because as we always say, when's the last time you heard from a room full of Black men educators about their needs, their perspectives, their experiences, and their aspirations? So it's a great learning opportunity for me and our team as well as others.
Yeah. Thank you, Sharif. So save the date now, folks, and make sure you register early. It will sell out. I'm gonna, as I mentioned, I'm gonna call an audible. I'm gonna jump to a different question, but I'm gonna combine it with a question in the chat. So James, we'll start with you on this one, and then Amanda, Sharif, please feel free to jump in. So James, the number one reason anyone leaves any job is usually because of who you work for. So how must we be thinking about the role of a school principal in the recruitment and retention of teachers of color? And I'm going to combine that, James, with, and factor in, or if you can, how can we get beyond the gatekeepers or poor HR practices that keep people of color outside of administration or outside of becoming principals as well? How does that factor into the recruitment and retention of teachers of color when we might struggle, or there's gatekeepers that prevent people of color from getting into administration as well?
Well, in my experience, the principal is the most important decision maker in teacher hiring. I mean, whereas there are some districts that maybe do some hiring at the central office level, and then the principals get to pick from the chosen candidates, 99% of the time, principals are selecting the teachers that are going to come into their building. And there's a big power there, because by selecting the teachers, you're also selecting essentially the candidate pool for the future principals and the future superintendents and everyone else. Because in most cases, the principal and certainly the superintendent is going to have been a teacher in their career. And so in my districts, we did a ton of training with principals on how to make sure that they were asking questions that were fair to any candidate that came in the room, and reducing bias in selection, and so on and so forth. But the other thing that we talk about all the time is that if you go into interviewing with diversity as a value and a priority that you hold, then you are more likely to respect diversity as a positive when you're interviewing, and be more likely to select the folks that you need to have the best staff possible. And Sharif already talked about all the research on the benefits of having a very diverse staff. And so, HR departments can be gatekeepers, and there are ways to make the processes easier. One of the things that I think HR departments can do is to make sure that they have systems that recruit teachers across county and district lines, so that it's easier for counties and districts to share candidates with those around them, especially in areas that may have less vacancies, or maybe one district has all of their physics teachers full, but another district right next door has 2 or 3 physics openings. And the ability to share across lines is really important. I never got it done, but I really wanted to create a state application portal when I was a state superintendent, so that all of our districts could share the information amongst candidates between themselves. The other thing that I think that a good administrative practice is, don't wait for vacancies to begin recruiting teachers. The schools that I end up seeing be fully staffed are the schools that started hiring before they even knew who was going to be unavailable. And so, I would recruit for elementary teachers all year long, and I would hire those based on the number of contracts or vacancies I knew that I had. But I was always working with 3 or 4 candidates that I knew I was going to eventually have an opening, and I knew I was going to be able to get them into the district. And then the other thing that I did as a principal is I made sure the kids in my school knew that I wanted them to come back and teach in my community because I wanted my teachers to look like my community. The other thing that I did is, as a principal, I went out and recruited folks that I wanted to come to my community. I was intentional about recruiting at school districts job fairs that weren't even my school district, but maybe had a more diverse workforce, or recruiting at some of the larger universities. I always hesitate to say go recruit at HBCUs, not because that's not a good strategy, but that can't be your only strategy. And I hear so many people talk all the time about how going to the HBCU or MSI job fair was their strategy to diversify their workforce. But frankly, the number one thing you can do, and I'll end on this, is you have to get the folks that are applying for jobs with you to believe that you care about diversity, and that when you hire someone to come into your community as a new teacher, that they will feel respected as a member of your community and feel a sense of belonging in their community. And you're not just going to moat that in one interview, and you're not going to fix one gatekeeper in any HR department. It's actually building a culture amongst your school where everyone feels a responsibility for diversifying the workforce. Education is such a word of mouth, right? Like, I got my friend to come work here, or I called somebody I knew for that vacancy. And I can't tell you how many people are passing around our job openings to each other to try to get more folks into our school districts. Well, they're not going to get people passing around your job openings if they don't believe in you as a leader and as a principal, that you are going to respect their friends when they come into the community.
And David, if I could just add, one of the most curious things that I've noticed across the country are people who have to, Philadelphia, for example, but it's nationwide often. They have to hire, in Philly, every year they have to hire between 700 and 1,000 teachers a year. And that's with a 90% retention rate, right? Like, so it's people moving, people retiring, people changing, professions. Between 700 and 1,000 teachers a year. And until recently, there was no formal teacher academy in the school, in the district. And so it's like we're ignoring the high school students and we're chasing vacancies, for the fall or right after winter break, right? Like, and that is such a short-term, myopic, and undermining, perspective and orientation that, it's, again, ignores the ecosystem. And then, what James again reiterated, that I will reiterate again, is this idea of what are you inviting people into, and how are the current educators of color, how are they experiencing your leadership in district is going to be, those are your ambassadors for your district. So we have to stop ignoring high school students. Many districts, and I get that they don't always have the capacity. That's why, like, we involve that in our work. But, like, how are you supporting alumni as they're matriculating through college to actually possibly return? What support are they getting? And they may not hear anything from the district that claims that they want them in 4 years. And 4 years is a long time to ignore someone. And then at the last minute when they graduate, they say, "Oh, we want you." And so it can't be this organic process of like, "Oh, well, you're a student for 13 years, so if you're interested in being a teacher, you'll just come knock on the door." Be deliberate, be thoughtful, and really create a pipeline that has insulation around it.
Yeah, Sharif, I think some of what you're saying, it reminds me a lot of we always say it's the thoughts and prayers approach. Thoughts and prayers that we get a kid excited about teaching in high school, and they'll magically navigate financial aid, registering for classes, and then best of all, paying tuition to a university to provide free labor to a school district. And we call that student teaching. That in and of itself has prevented thousands, if not tens, if not hundreds of thousands of aspiring educators from pursuing teaching because they can't afford to work for free, or or quit side jobs they have to then work for free. Like, it's just crazy. So I really appreciate that. Other questions in the chat. Want to get to some of these have been hit on in different ways already. Sharif, in creating and building and establishing the teacher pipeline for Black educators, Black males in particular, what have you found are the reasons Black males choose to teach? Why do Black boys want to teach?
Yeah, this has been, really fascinating, and it's one of the consistencies that drew me into the profession once I was invited into the profession back in 1993, and high school students that we interviewed this year. That the opportunity to again lift as they climb, to support their community, to fight for educational and racial justice, where teaching well is a form of activism. Like, all of these things are part of why the Black men and young Black men are interested in teaching. Time and time again. I put the Donors Choose report in the chat, and it's so consistent with what we're seeing in our teacher academy. Similar to Educator Rising, we have a teacher academy where we work with particularly high school students that serve Black students, and we use it as not only this Black pedagogical framework that has always been used in Black communities to teach well, and also a historical lens. Like, oh, you often learn about white educational theorists, but what have Black educational theorists, Black behavior theorists, what have they poured into the instructional frameworks over centuries? And using that, and that that resonates with so many of our Black youth. But is one of the common themes, David, that young Black men have expressed. Some of them are like, hey, what gives me pause is how I'm experiencing school myself. And so we have to really look at, again, it's a long-term, short and long-term goal. Is not only recruitment, but also how are they experiencing being a young Black male student, to even get them to think about and being able to envision themselves in it. It's always sad when we hear from young Black youth say, like, what gives me pause is I don't know if I want to be a colleague of my current teachers. Because of how I'm being treated now as a student, I can only imagine how I'll be treated as a professional later. Speaking of reports, we did a report with another of the 1 million teachers of color partners of ours, Teach Plus, where specifically high school students, and again, partnering with Ed Rising, students who are participating in Ed Rising, and these are students of color who are already interested in teaching, but they also shared, here's what gives me pause. And one of the things that they talked about is, we're seeing how educators of color are being treated in our schools. And we don't know if so not only how we're being treated as students, but we see educators of color, Latino and Black teachers, and how they're being treated within the system. And that also gives them angst. And these are already students who are interested.
This one, Amanda, we'll start with you, just based on especially your advocacy and legislative work, and as you go into other states. This person, and understandably so, stayed anonymous. They said, those of us in anti-DEI states are working to find ways to recruit and retain within these difficult frames. What advice, sources of advocacy, and productive subversion could any of the panelists offer? But Amanda, if you would like to go first, and then Sharif or James.
Yeah, it's a real tough one. And we are working in Texas, where the environment is definitely challenging. And so, but I think it can kind of cut across where you might be experiencing, real obstacles to the orientation of diversification of your educator workforce. And so what we've been doing in Texas, for example, is really talking about the educator pipeline and diversifying it as a workforce challenge. And wanting to really address the workforce issue that the state will face if we aren't broadening where we recruit, who we recruit, and who comes into the profession and stays in the profession. So it's very important that we can continue to do the work. And sometimes, again, you have to work within some of these unfortunate barriers that exist. And we're seeing, obviously, this wave happening across the country of a lot of fear being put out there around anything DEI, obviously, what came down from the Supreme Court on affirmative action. So we have to find a number of different workarounds, nomenclature, thinking about things, again, from a workforce standpoint, because we are a diverse country. We will be over 50% all people of color. And it's a reality that this country has to face. The reality is that our students are children of color. So that's where our teaching force is going to come from. So you have to paint the picture of reality, whether you like DE&I or not, it's a reality. So those are ways in which we've been talking about how you sort of reposition the work that needs to be done. Those aren't sort of I think the answers that I always want to have, because I think you also need to build your advocacy to also be combating these policies on a constant basis. So it's important that we continue to have a voice in education, that we ensure that we are working hard to make sure that our school boards and school committees are diverse themselves, that we are coming together to say that these policies and what we're trying to do around DE&I in terms of the elimination of it we won't stand for. So it is a both and, where you work to build the advocacy, where you work to build the voices of our communities to demand what is needed, because our families want diverse educators as well. Let me just tell you that. We run a program in Houston that's soon coming to Massachusetts called Familias Latinas por la Educación. And this is a fellowship that we do for Spanish predominant speaking families. And one of the number one issues that they always cite is that they want more diverse educators in their school buildings, because their children need to have that support. They need to see those mirrors. They need to see those role models, and the families need to feel comfortable and safe in their schools to ask questions and to have people to go to. So it's not just about DE&I and eliminating it. It's actually what you do in destroying what's possible for what school cultures can be when you have all the right elements working together in terms of who should be teaching our students, who should be leading in our school buildings, what our families demand, and what our students want.
All right. Recognizing time, I got a question I'm going to try to combine, I think 4 questions from the chat into one. I'm going to try to pull this off. Okay, so
you
Amanda,
could do it, David. You could do it.
I think I got it. I think I got it. All right, Amanda, Sharif, James, either one of you, please feel free, and everybody jump in. But from a aspiring teacher lens, how can we ensure that if we're recruiting an aspiring teacher of color, that we see them to and through so that they actually graduate, they actually then become a teacher, whether it's wraparound supports, what are the things we need to do? And then second, for individuals who lack cultural competency, and specifically someone called out, hey, I'd love to be able to learn Spanish so I could be better for my school community. What opportunities can somebody ask of their district? And if their district doesn't provide it, where could they go to self-educate, to learn about other cultures and get more proficient in cultural competencies of the school communities they serve? So the one question is geared towards seeing somebody to and through, an aspiring educator of color. And then for somebody like myself, let's just use a white male example, who does not speak Spanish or lacks cultural competencies? Where can I go? Who should I ask? Does anybody want to take stab at both of those, one of the two?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. I think, one, when you're like supporting the pipeline again, this insulation, I think, again, it can't be, I think too often the recruitment and retention efforts are disconnected from the social, economic, and political realities that aspiring educators of color face, as well as veteran educators, right? So Amanda's talking about, policies. James was talking about like, the economics and things like that. So all of that is has to be intentional. So for example, we have this teacher academy. It's one thing for us, like, all right, you had this great CTE model that we provided, you learned all these things, you're interested in teaching, but we'll see you in 4 years, good luck. Instead, what we do, we couple that with a fellowship. So we have this Black Teacher Pipeline Fellowship, and we invest in them. So the district, they may not necessarily be able to support the alumni all the way through, but find out who can. What are those wraparound services? What universities are they going to become certified? And we support them throughout their process. One, if they're a Black male and they're interested in teaching, they may be the only one in their ed classes as a Black male, right? But if I'm disconnected from that, I just say, oh, I want to recruit, I want more Black men, and not even thinking about, okay, what are the realities that they'll face as they matriculate through college? So thinking about those things, and the best way to learn is ask them, what did you read? Read the Donaldson report about, all these, hundreds and hundreds of Black men, and then connect the plan to support what their realities are. So for us, the economics is, Amanda and James both spoke about, was huge for us. And so, or huge from what we were hearing on our learning. And so we connected that to the fellowship. So with the fellowship, they received $5,000 a year because they were interested in teaching. Their school invested in our CTE model. And so then we're supporting these students in returning. So they not only do they get $5K a year as they're matriculating through college, they get this fellowship, this network, this community. Many of them attend the convening, for example, but also in addition, monthly, they have touch points throughout their college career. But then when they return and they get to their 5th year of teaching, they get a $20,000 retention stipend from us that we fundraise just to say this was so important. We recognize the wealth gap in this country. We recognize maybe the low starting salary that you have. We recognize the loans you still may have had, even though you got $5K a year, that may not cover everything. That $40K investment in itself and the community combined is something that can support, as they matriculate through.
Thank you, Sharif. James?
So I'll jump in and recognize, and we're almost out of time. The first thing that I would do is just make sure you have a program to train future teachers in your high school. And honestly, I don't care if it's ours, but with 13% of the workforce being in education, we should make sure our career and technical education programs in every high school in America are supporting that future workforce. And, if you looked at any other industry and they had 13% of the workforce, you'd have people knocking down doors to make sure there were career and technical education programs in high schools to support that many jobs in the community. And then, I hear things all the time about, well, career and technical education programs are expensive. You will spend more on wood for your carpentry program than you will do to spend on a future teacher program in your high school. It's an imperative. If we want to get rid of the teacher shortage, we have to get kids excited about these jobs earlier. We have to get them thinking about it in high school. And then we have to build out the compensation, the working conditions, and the supports that come after that so that we retain them. But that would be my biggest thing is you can't have a to college and then through college and into career pathway that doesn't start with recruiting students before they get to college. You're not just going to magically get kids who are majoring in economics and English and math to say, you know what, I'm going to go be a teacher, unless you've done something to inspire that passion in them, at least until we can get compensation more than double what it is now.
Mm-hmm. Amanda, I want to give you a chance for a final thought.
I mean, I just want to cite what I think is an additional promising practice to what my colleagues are already doing in our schools. I found it very interesting to see all the success in early college programs, and sort of to the point of having specific pathways for different industries. You see them in healthcare and STEM and other pathways. And so we're really looking to see how we actually create and expand an educator pathway through early college to help sort of condense the time it takes to get to your professional life and frankly to college. So I just wanted to cite that as another opportunity. But look, I agree, we've got to look at all the resources that are out there and take advantage of what states are doing, what other districts are doing in our states, and learn from that and tap into what I think is already sort of a fractured way in which we sort of look at leveraging what's already existing and bringing that into a more holistic way in which our schools are thinking about doing this work.
Well, on that note, thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Sharif. Thank you, James, for sharing your expertise. We did our best to get to as many questions as possible. There were just a lot of good ones in there. Feel free to submit them in, and we'll try to follow up on some of those later. With that, thanks to Educators Rising for co-hosting this with us. Thanks, James. And with that, folks, keep doing the great work you all are doing across the country to recruit and retain teachers of colors. Our students deserve it. All students deserve it to have teachers of diverse backgrounds and more teachers that look like them. So thank you for what you all do. Take care, and signing off.